consistent work on this. Tonight, of course, as Congresswoman Fudge indicated, we're talking about the foreclosure crisis. And as we all know, the roots of this current economic crisis are grounded in the housing market, the explosion of the subprime markets, and the unregulated and uncontrolled growth of the derivatives market that drove some of our largest financial companies, our financial services companies, into bankruptcy. And, you know, we have to be truthful about this. The economic and fiscal policies of the Bush administration have left our country in a mess. They created this mess. And many of us, and I remember this very vividly, we warned about this impending housing crisis years ago. As a member of the Financial Services Committee for 8 years, I remember expressing my concern about the housing bubble and the subprime loans that were fueling the housing crisis, and also the consequences to our economy if the bubble ever popped. But our warnings fell on deaf ears. I consistently questioned former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan about the growing housing bubble, and coming from California, we saw this each and every day. The increasing rates of foreclosure and the rapid growth of subprime and other exotic home mortgages. But as this crisis was brewing, the Bush administration and the Federal Reserve and HUD turned a deaf ear. Now, equity in one's home is really the primary path in our country for accumulating wealth, to send one's children to college, to start a small business, and to really enhance the quality of life. Now, this American dream of home ownership has turned into a nightmare for millions. The impact of a foreclosure also extends far beyond the personal tragedy of the family that loses their home. The foreclosure crisis now has placed property values throughout the neighborhood. It reduces the revenues for local and state governments. It causes increased prices in the rental markets, and the abandoned homes often become the blight of our communities. And we took a bus tour in my own community and saw neighborhoods just totally in shambles as a result of homes that had been foreclosed on. Unfortunately, predatory lending targeted vulnerable populations. Predatory lenders went after communities of color, went after individuals who they knew were vulnerable and were targets. And to me, that should be looked at very seriously, and hopefully one of these days some will be prosecuted for that. When we tried to encourage the banks to participate in voluntary foreclosure prevention programs to help families in distress, they balked and made every excuse to avoid participating. And now millions more families are threatened with bankruptcy and foreclosure. AIG, this is unbelievable. AIG can provide, what was this, $165 million in bonuses? Taxpayer dollars? Again, this is criminal. It's wrong, it's immoral. For much of the time that I sat on the Financial Services Committee and its subcommittee on housing and community opportunity, I can tell you that much of the work was focused on affordable housing. In fact, I can remember sitting in a subcommittee hearing, talking to then Congressman, now Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont, sketching out the outlines of legislation creating the Federal Affordable Housing Trust Fund. Although I'm glad we were able to finally get this trust fund legislation through the Congress, we are all acutely aware of the funding problems that we are seeing now as a result of the foreclosure and economic crisis that we're facing today. So there is much, much work to be done. That's why many of us are pushing for a moratorium, and I think we need a moratorium on foreclosures. We've been pushing for this from the start of this crisis. That's why we work to push at every point to include significant and meaningful foreclosure relief and to keep people in their homes, including bankruptcy reform. But it hasn't been easy, especially given the Bush administration's disastrous economic policies that I mentioned earlier. But these policies range from deregulating the financial industry to the war in Iraq. Yes, this war in Iraq, $10 billion a month, has been part of this huge problem. These tax cuts to the rich, which created this financial mess. I mean, this is really an unbelievable moment that this administration has stepped up to the plate on to move forward to help turn this economy around. Despite the resistant Bush administration, at least we were able to include important neighborhood stabilization funding, over $8.25 million for my own city last year in the Housing and Economic Recovery Act. Again, thanks to the consistent and effective work of Congresswoman Maxine Waters. Today, finally, a new day has dawned, and we have hope because the majority in Congress and President Obama understand that we can and that we must use every available tool to address this crisis head-on. The Congressional Black Caucus fought hard, led by Congresswoman Maxine Waters, to ensure that an additional $2 billion in neighborhood stabilization funding in the American Recovery and Investment Act was included. Not enough, but it's a start. And I'm pleased that Secretary Geithner and the President have announced a $75 billion plan to keep families in their homes and to keep home ownership affordable. But even with all of our efforts, we all know the enormity and the gravity of this situation, and this requires much more. We have the obligation to make the dream of home ownership accessible to all Americans and to help them achieve those dreams by limiting these unscrupulous lenders, and I mean they are unscrupulous, these unscrupulous brokers, and they are unscrupulous, and these real estate agents who really seek to profit at the expense of the people that they purport to serve. And we're not casting a net on all of these individuals and institutions, but I think the data shows us that there's been a lot of bad faith. There's been a lot of activity in the financial services and in the real estate industry that really caused us to question a lot of the practices of some of these individuals. And I think that there must be more accountability and more oversight, and some need to be called on the carpet as a result. Finally, let me just say that I have to congratulate our Speaker for helping to take strong steps. Chairman Frank, Congresswoman Maxine Waters, these individuals work day and night to help us figure out ways to help families in distress, and our bills to improve FHA, to create grants, to provide home buyers with the incentives, to strengthen the oversight of this mortgage industry, which has gone wild, if you ask me. This movement and some of these initiatives, I think, will help begin to mitigate some of the damage of this housing crisis. But without the safety net of the courts, the average homeowner will still too often be left to the rise and fall of the markets and the whims of the mortgage marketeers. And so bankruptcy reform must be enacted. So thank you again, Congresswoman Fudge, for organizing this special order. Thank you for allowing us to raise the alarm once again and to sound the alarm so that the country understands that we're on the case day and night, and this is quite a moment, and it's quite a mess that we're faced with as a result of the last 8 years. But I'm confident that with President Obama, Speaker Pelosi, and our leadership, that we're going to dig ourselves out of this hole. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you.